Welcome to 100 Days Digging a Hole. Day 1. I spawned in this lovely village and immediately borrowed some of their wheat. I mean, they didn't need all that, right? I also borrowed their bed. Next, I punched this tree to death. Yep, with wheat. I then used the corpse of that tree to make some tools to collect some of his cousins nearby. I punched some grass with a flower. There were a couple of seeds I was after here, a little bit of wheat seeds and some industrial hemp. Nice. There was also this blacksmith in the village with, whoa. But I mean, this stuff belongs to him, so I left. I wandered off into the desert, collected some sugarcane along the way, and I came upon this little guy. He really liked my flower. See you, buddy. This place seemed like as good a spot as any, so I set up a tree farm, made myself a wooden pick, and wandered down into some nearby caves. Pretty quickly got myself set up with a stone pick and a stone sword, which was handy when dealing with the cave's current inhabitants. They weren't that friendly, but the super sweet stone sword managed to take them out. By the time I'd been down here for a while, it was night, and it was time to leave. Day 2, it was time to fully upgrade to the best of the best. Stone. But it would also be a good idea to start smelting up some of the iron we managed to get. Iron's alright too. For some reason, I thought that having 4 stone shovels definitely meant that I was ready to start working on the mine, and I set to work trying to dig the main outline. In retrospect, this was a little bit too soon to start trying to dig the hole, but it did fill in the day. Once the iron had finished melting up, I chucked together an iron pick and an iron shovel, and I did some more digging. Nice. By day 3, I'd realised that stone shovels really weren't going to cut it, so I went down to the caves nearby, where I managed to find a bunch of coal and iron, which was going to be very useful stuff moving forward. After spending most of the day doing that, I thought I'd whip up a quick engineer's hammer to try and double my ore. Unfortunately, that's not how that works. Day 4 came along, and it was time to start working on getting some upgrades. I started by collecting a bunch of clay, and created myself a hemp farm. Now, I've been running into a few mobs while I was down mining, so some iron armor was next on the list, along with an iron sword. This took me all day. Day 5, I was just down in the caves. Now, while it would have been cool, kinda, to try and survive just off a big open cast mine up top, it seemed like it was going to take far too long to even get through all of the sand that was there, so I needed to try and get a lot of resources for some future machinery that would help with this. I even found diamonds. That's 5 diamond shovels right there. I mined throughout the day, and by the time I made it back to the surface, there were mobs everywhere. Days 6 and 7 I spent tending to my crops, gathering clay, making obsidian, building a coke oven so I could turn coal into coal coke. Not as delicious as you might think. I also opened a portal to the nether, so I could quickly grab some netherrack and magma, which was going to let me start working on the blast furnace. By day 8, the blast furnace was finished. This was going to let me turn iron and coal coke into steel, which is slightly worse than diamond, but hey, coal and iron are pretty easy to get in comparison, though it is a slow process. While waiting for some steel to finish, I was able to use creosote, a somewhat annoying byproduct of the coal to coal coke process, to make treasured wood, which is an essential component when progressing through immersive engineering. Eventually though, I was able to make myself a steel sword, which did a whole 1 heart more damage. On day 9, I forgot to push record, but I got myself a horse from the village, and I may have borrowed a saddle from the blacksmith. The horse's name is Charles. That was him. Using one of the books the villagers had just left lying around, I whipped up the Immersive Engineering book on day 10, which taught me all about engineering. I smelted up some copper in Minecraft's much less impressive blast furnace, as I needed that for making wires. Making wires consisted of grabbing some wire cutters, hammering copper ingots into plates, cutting those plates into copper wire, and then wrapping that wire around a stick to create a copper wire coil. This in turn somehow wraps around an iron ingot to make a copper coil block, which with a little more iron and redstone creates the magnetic dynamo. If you attach something that spins to this, such as a windmill, you'll start generating power. Now that the first windmill had been constructed, that hemp farm that was set up earlier becomes very helpful for making tough fabric. You can use this for making sails, which makes the windmill spin faster. Faster equals more power. Cool. Now on day 11 I'd forgotten to push record again. I did near the end of the day, but I missed the big part of it where I was assembling components for the next machine. A metal press. But I did manage to record some of me digging sand. I did this for the rest of the day. On day 12 I made an enchanting table. But it turns out you need lapis to enchant anything, which I hadn't yet found. The open cast mine proved pretty ineffective, so I went back down into the cave systems to try and find some, but instead I found uranium, which sounds cool, but I never actually ended up using it for anything. I spent a long time underground, so it was day 13 before I made my way back up to the surface, and made an alloy furnace since I had the materials. I used this to turn gold and silver into electrum, which was going to be used for some machine components shortly. On day 14 I crafted steel mechanical components and steel sheet metal, which, with a little electrum, created some heavy engineering blocks. I only needed one for right now, but I'd end up needing a whole lot more in the future. Built up a bit of a wooden shack thing for the metal press, and then realised that I needed leather, so I had to take Charles out for a spin. Deep into the desert and into the savannah to find some cows, which I shore with my steel sword. It was dark by the time I got back, but I had a nice, safe, comfortable sleep. On day 15, I constructed the metal press. This thing was going to need to be hooked up to the power, so using copper coils and tough fabric, I made some insulated wire. Getting electrocuted all the time isn't particularly fun. I hooked this up directly to the windmill for now, and I then built an engineer's crafting table. I didn't actually realise how cool this thing was at the time, but it holds items in both the crafting grid and in a little storage part underneath. Pretty sweet. In this, I crafted up the engineer's workbench, which is used for making some of the components a little bit cheaper than you can in just a crafting table, but it was going to need blueprints, which requires lapis that I still hadn't found. My hemp farm was flourishing by this point. On day 16 I went down into the caves again, and stayed here for all of day 17 as well. There was a lot of mining. I found a mine shaft, and eventually located some lapis. I wound up needing to make a bed out of string since I couldn't find the exit, but after waking up on day 18 I almost immediately found it. Using the lapis I found, I was able to make a couple of different blueprints, one of which lets me make metal press molds, so I made a plate mold, and that was able to create steel plates without having to use a hammer. It's also much more satisfying to watch. Days 19 to 21 were spent working towards the Crusher, which required quite a lot of steel, and other metals like iron and copper, but a lot of steel. I actually built a second blast furnace to try and keep up with it, but this did end up being a little bit of a waste of time. You kind of need 2 coal coke ovens. While waiting on the steel to be created, I changed up the power situation a bit, putting an MV capacitor on top of a power pole to store some energy while I wasn't using it. By the end of day 21, I'd finally constructed the Crusher. This thing sounds impressive, looks impressive, and is impressive. Not only will it crush mobs that fall in, or you if you aren't careful, if you chuck ores in it, you'll get double the dust out, and sometimes some extra stuff too. Day 22, I started digging a trench away from an initial mining hole I'd made, hoping to get some resources. After a fair bit of time doing that, I'd actually discovered that crushing sandstone gets you nitrate dust, which can be combined with sulfur to make gunpowder. I didn't actually have any sulfur just yet, so I whipped up some TNT the old-fashioned way and gave it a go on day 23. The results were meh. I knew I'd eventually be getting access to better mining tools and didn't have a supply of gunpowder yet anyway. I spent the rest of the day mining this strip and managed to get a whole 16 iron. Probably not the most efficient way to spend my time. Day 24, I had this awkward encounter with a villager where I borrowed some of his books. He knew. I also brought some cows and sheep back to the base, setting up a lovely sand enclosure for them, and this had all taken all of day 24. Days 25 to 26 were spent moving crops, breeding future books, and planting a whole lot of hemp for the future. A lot of windmill spam coming up. Day 27, I spent mining in the cutout. I ended up sleeping in the cutout. Day 28, and I was down into the caves once again, as the surface mining really wasn't working out well for getting resources. The caves did. And I bred more books. Nice. Days 29 to 33 were spent working on some infrastructure. I started by putting together the advanced blast furnace. This guy was a lot faster at turning iron into steel, and you could even power external headers to speed this up even more. I didn't have these yet. Next on the list was the squeezer. This turns seeds into plant oil, which is half of biodiesel. By day 30, I had everything for the squeezer organised and managed to assemble it. And after hooking it up to power, which would be an issue with only one windmill, managed to get that first bit of plant oil. This thing's just so cool. Day 31 and I was assembling the fermenter. This turns things like sugarcane and potatoes into ethanol, the second half of biodiesel. I then got distracted by this llama spitting war while trying to acquire our wandering trader's llamas. You guys are brutal. By the end of day 32, I'd completed assembling the refinery. This thing looks really cool, and it's what combines the plant oil and ethanol into biodiesel. Why did I want biodiesel, you might ask? Well, on day 33, I crafted the mining drill. Useless without the drill head. I went for the steel one. It's fancy. And combining these in the engineer's workbench resulted in my new best friend, Drilly. The drill. Since I didn't have any piping set up yet, I used buckets to transfer the plant oil and ethanol to the refinery. Finally, I had biodiesel. Yep, 3x3 mining. And it was also really good at clearing out sand, which is awesome, as I had a lot of sand to deal with. Day 34, I spent mining. I ended up using all of my diesel, so I planted some potatoes, as they can also be used for making ethanol. I made an HV capacitor, not to switch over to HV power, but just because it can store more energy. You can still hook LV stuff up to it. Days 35 to 38 were spent breeding cows, building windmills, mining, harvesting cows, harvesting crops, and processing the bits and pieces I managed to get while mining. On day 39, I put together some vacuum tubes. These were used for creating garden cloches, which you can grow crops in. And I made half of the buzzsaw, because the drill had been so awesome. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough steel for the blade. The rest of day 39 was spent trying to figure out how water goes into the garden cloche. This isn't it, and this is also not how you do it. By day 40, I'd figured out that you needed a pump. Once you attach some pipes, water will flow into the cloche. You need water in order for the plants to even grow, but you also need to whack the side of it with a hammer to set it up to output fluids. Look, it's growing. By now I had enough steel for crafting the saw blade, and the saw is the best thing I've ever seen. So on day 41 I set out to find an unsuspecting forest to test this on, and eventually came across this dark oak forest. The saw had some issues when mining trees close together. It ended up taking out some of the leaves on nearby ones, and if a tree was missing too many leaves, I guess the saw didn't realise that it was a tree, and so would only mine one block at a time. Still, way better than an axe. By the time I got back it was dark, and it turned out the buzzsaw was actually a decent weapon. Brutal. Days 42 to 44 were spent both digging out the cutout I'd made, which was just so much faster with the drill, and popping deeper underground to try and get some more diamonds. I eventually used these diamonds to make a diamond saw blade, which gave me silk touch without having to get the enchant. But it turned out this was actually pretty slow. Day 47 I crafted the core sample drill. This lets you find special ore deposits that only an excavator can dig up, which you discover by looking at the samples this thing digs up. Sweet. I think this one meant I could find gold, copper, and uranium, but there's either information online or in the engineer's manual if you're after it. These deposits are also chunk-based, so it's probably worth checking out every chunk. Days 48 to 49 were spent core drilling and a lot of chunks to see what I could find, including here in the nether, which probably went about as well as you'd expect if you're just standing out in the open. Surprisingly, I didn't die. And yeah, I didn't hear, but you can find netherite ore deposits in the nether. Once back in the overworld, I took Charles for a ride a bit further into the desert and instantly found some oil, which I made sure I marked, obviously, but I never actually ended up going back to do anything with this. Yet. On day 50, I got bad omen when I was rudely interrupted, and created some external headers for my blast furnace to try and speed up my steel production, as I constantly found myself running low on steel. Days 51 to 58 were spent improving my power situation. I started by crafting a bunch of dynamos to be used on windmills, and alloying a heap of gold and silver into electrum for MV wires and components. I then tore down my current windmills, so I could move them further away, which would hopefully prevent too much spaghetti wiring in the future. Yeah, right. I also created a cube of HV capacitors, which was going to use as some bulk energy storage, as I wasn't running most of my machines constantly. Day 53, I was heading out into the wilderness. The initial plan was to try and find a mesa so I'd get some terracotta that I'd need for a buttload of MV relays and connectors. I ended up finding a swamp instead, which was okay as it had clay. But turns out you need an upgrade for using the drill underwater. Day 54, I was back at the base making the oxygen tank that I needed. This also meant that I'd fully upgraded my drill, and I got a cool shader that made my drill look neat. With the new paint job and upgrade, I went back out to the swamp to get myself some clay. I stayed here for the rest of the day to make the most of the trip, but by the time I got back it was day 56. After I smelted this clay into terracotta, I started the process of replacing all LV components. This included every single relay and connector, as well as replacing all the old wiring with Electrum MV wiring, which I made sure to insulate as well. But by the end of the day I'd pretty much finished, and everything was now medium voltage. At least I think that's what MV stands for. And at the end of day 58, there were windmills everywhere. Day 59 was spent upgrading my enchanting setup. Finally got a Silk Touch enchant, but was lacking the experience, so I went down to the mines to get some more XP. And on day 60, I found this cool mine shaft that had a whole bunch of loot, especially for Charles. But then this happened. Yep, that's painful. On day 61, the grind became real. All the way until day 83. This was my life now. Digging sand, trying to flatten out the mine area all through the night. On day 65, it was starting to tidy up quite nice, and by day 67 it looked like this. That's kind of one single layer, and this was going to take a while. On day 68, I started work on the outline of the next layer down. I kind of wanted to end up with a stepped down pattern all the way to the bottom. If you look at pictures of Australian opencast mines, you'll kind of get the idea. Now, the strategy for this did change over time. As you can see, it's kind of a bit hard to see where you're going, so I eventually settled on digging like a single layer deep outer ring and then mining from one side to the other. I had a lot of time to get used to it. By the end of day 69, I was making good progress. I decided to do one half at a time, the divider being this like 3 wide cutout I'd ended up with, but it turned out this was kind of the smaller half. By day 70, I'd fully mined out that first layer, and it looked kind of cool. Pretty similar to what I'd been going for, actually, but now there was nothing to do but start on that next layer down. Yeah, I did say this is my life now. Day 72, and I'd mined out the 3rd layer, and by day 76, I was down on the 6th. But the big mining pit was really starting to take shape now. Let's skip forward now to day 83, where I'd finished the half. At least without getting too narrow at the bottom, which was something that came up when I started the next half. But this was day 83. I was not going to get this whole thing finished by day 100. And after all that mining, this is what I got. Not a bad effort. I did have to use some iron to make steel for making more drill heads as I burned through quite a few of these, but this was actually quite a lot of materials once you chucked it in the crusher. Okay, so on day 84, I decided I was going to head to the nether, find a fortress, get wither skeletons, summon the wither, kill them, get a beacon, and it was going to help me mine faster. Now there was some cool exploration happening here. I did find a bastion, some lava, and this cool double bastion, but it took me quite a while to get the wither skulls, and I ended up having to go back and get myself looting on a sword, which helped quite a bit, but it kind of turned out this was a big waste of time. So here we are, on day 100. Very little progress on the whole, looking completely over-prepared to fight the wither. But, yeah, this is how that went. Turns out that while milk does heal you from the wither, it also removes potion positive effects. I did eventually beat the wither, assembled the beacon, and was ready to feel the power of haste. But it kind of seemed like this did nothing. I'm almost certain that haste had absolutely no effect on the mining drill. On day 103, I decided it was time to build an excavator. I wanted to at least finish the beacon, and it turns out that takes quite a lot of iron. So I whipped up this snazzy shockproof suit, assembled some HV components, and ran these very dangerous HV wires down to the bottom of the pit. I actually never got electrocuted by them, surprisingly. And by day 107, I'd finished assembling the excavator. Now this thing looks seriously, seriously cool. As I kind of mentioned earlier, it digs up hidden resources from deep underground, but these don't really exist. You couldn't find them and mine them with a pickaxe. You're essentially turning power into ores, but it does it in such a cool way. Look at that. You can actually see the ore getting dug up. And it was mostly bauxite, which unfortunately doesn't work as a beacon base. But there was iron in there. This thing was also very, very heavy on power usage. On day 110, I made some jerry cans to hold diesel. They each held about 10 buckets of diesel, which was going to save me so many trips back up to refill. I really wish I'd made these sooner. On day 119, the mine looked like this. It was really starting to look cool, and was very, very impressive to walk through, but I really wanted to finish that beacon with the hopes that Haste 2 would actually help. So by day 122, I had assembled this, the diesel generator. This was me finally hooking it up to my power system, and this guy was just going to run on the excess diesel that I hadn't actually been using in my drill, like the other machines had been backstuffing. And this thing makes enough power by itself to run an excavator non-stop. And yep, it's pretty noisy. On day 124, I dug into this mine shaft, which was pretty neat. And Skeleton has bad aim. See you guys. I also finally finished the full beacon. It was time to feel the power of Haste 2. Had it been worth the massive sidetrack that was my adventure into the Nether, or was it a complete waste of time? It was exactly the same speed. Day 125, I managed to dig into some lava pockets, so I decided I'd turn these into obsidian. This was me trying to do just a little area at a time, unsuccessfully, but luckily the drill was actually pretty quick at mining obsidian. On day 127, slimes had started spawning, so there was at least one slime chunk somewhere around here, which is kind of neat. On day 130, I'd finally found the first lapis I'd ever found in this pit mine. This is totally not worth it for resource gathering, it just looks really cool. On day 131, I was so close to being level with the bottom of the first half, which I'd been very concerned about previously. I didn't think they were going to line up. I'd recommend not digging in halves, and not fighting creepers right next to your excavator. On day 132, I was only one layer away from being even with what would be the final layer. Soon, I would be able to stop digging. Soon. By the end of day 133, it was done. It was finally over. With just a little bit of a tidy up. And on day 134, I removed the floating beacon. That beacon that I spent so long working towards, that as far as I could tell, did absolutely nothing. But this was it. It's done. One giant open cast mine. Just look at that. And as the sun set on this ridiculous hole on the ground, I couldn't help but look over at all my chests filled with sand and stones and junk, and just think to myself, I'm not sorting any of that out. Like, at all. And that was it. 134 days digging a hole. Excluding the complete waste of time that was getting that beacon. But, yeah. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and, let me know if you'd like to see things like this in the future. Next projects are probably going to be a little bit different. Probably some slightly smaller projects than 100 days digging a hole, but it should be kind of cool. And we'll of course be checking out some more modern Minecraft stuff as well. So, yeah. Once again, thanks for watching, and it's been Classic Duff. And this was a long time to dig a hole.